The alarms had not even finished screaming when I picked up my coffee and took another sip. Around me, the entire command deck of the embassy station UES Horizon had turned into a storm of shouting voices and flashing red lights. Officers ran between consoles. A young technician named Oliver Bennett gripped the edge of his station so hard his knuckles turned white. Outside the viewport, space itself seemed to fold open, and one by one, the warships of the Vrixari Empire began sliding out of the dark, like blades being drawn from a sheath. I counted 40 of them before I stopped counting. It did not matter how many there were. What mattered was what came next, and I already had a fairly good idea. Ambassador Whitmore, Oliver's voice cracked as he turned to me. They are hailing us. Direct channel. Priority override. Then answer it, I said, setting my cup down on the console beside me. No need to keep an angry empire waiting. It only makes them angrier. He stared at me like I had lost my mind. Maybe I had, or maybe, after 11 years of sitting across tables from beings who could crush our entire species without blinking, I had simply run out of room to be afraid. The main screen flickered to life, and the face of Cortan Vale filled it. He was Vrixari, tall and gray-skinned, with eyes like burning coal, and a jaw built for crushing things that annoyed him. He wore the ceremonial armor of the Imperial Envoy, the kind only worn when a formal declaration was about to be made. Behind him, I could see the bridge of his flagship, full of officers standing at rigid attention. Ambassador Claire Whitmore, he said, and his translated voice came out flat and cold, stripped of any warmth the original language might have carried. By order of Emperor Zareth Mor, ruler of the Vrixari Empire, master of 11,000 worlds, I bring formal declaration. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Earth has violated imperial trade law. Earth has sheltered fugitives from imperial justice. Earth has refused tribute for 3 consecutive cycles. His eyes narrowed. For these crimes, the Vrixari Empire declares war upon your homeworld. You have 72 hours to surrender your government and your fleet, or your world will be corrected. The word corrected hung in the air like smoke. I had heard that word used before. In Vrixari records I was never supposed to see. It never meant anything good for the world it was used on. Behind me, I heard someone gasp. Someone else whispered a prayer. Oliver had gone completely still, his eyes wide, waiting for me to say something, anything, that might save us. I smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the kind of smile people wear to hide fear. A real one, slow and easy. The kind of smile you give an old friend who just told a joke you saw coming from a mile away. Cortan's expression flickered, just slightly. Confusion, maybe. Or irritation. It was hard to read Vrixari faces, but after 11 years, I had learned a few of their tells, and that twitch near his left eye was one of them. That's a very serious accusation, I said, keeping my voice light. Trade law violations, fugitives, missed tribute. I would love to see the documentation on all 3. Documentation is not required for a declaration of correction, Cortan snapped. The Empire's word is law. Of course it is, I said. I just find it strange that you would risk this particular war over paperwork nobody has actually shown me. You dare mock the Empire's authority? I would never dream of it. I leaned back in my chair, unhurried, the way you might lean back after a good meal. I am simply curious. 72 hours is a very specific number. Did the Emperor pick that, or did someone on his council suggest it? Cortan's jaw tightened. Why does that matter to you? Because 72 hours is exactly enough time for me to make a few calls, I said, and not nearly enough time for you to realize what those calls are going to cost you. For a long moment, Cortan simply stared at me through the screen, his burning eyes narrowing further, as if trying to find the trick hidden behind my words. On the bridge behind him, a few of his officers exchanged uneasy glances. War was supposed to make people afraid. It was supposed to make them beg, or shout, or cry. It was not supposed to make the enemy's chief diplomat smile like she had already won. You have 72 hours, Cortan said finally, his voice colder now. Use them however you wish. It will not save your world. The screen went dark. The moment the connection cut, the command deck erupted into noise again. Officers began shouting orders. Someone triggered the general alarm a second time, and Oliver turned to me with something close to panic in his eyes. Ambassador, with respect, what was that? They just declared war on us. 40 warships, maybe more coming. We do not have a fleet that can match even a fraction of that. Why are you smiling? I picked my coffee back up and took another sip. It had gone lukewarm, but I did not mind. Because Oliver, I said, the Vraxari Empire just made the single biggest mistake of the last 300 years, and they do not even know it yet. He blinked at me. What mistake? They think they are declaring war on Earth, I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my jacket. They are not. They are declaring war on everyone Earth has ever helped, everyone Earth has ever traded with fairly, and everyone who has ever owed us a favor and been waiting years for the chance to pay it back. I walked toward the viewport, watching the distant lights of the Vraxari fleet hanging in the dark like a held breath. Get me a secure channel, I said. I have some old friends to call, and we do not have much time to waste. Behind me, the room slowly began to settle, officers turning back to their stations, the panic in their voices fading into something quieter, something that almost sounded like hope. Oliver stood beside me a moment longer, studying the fleet outside, then studying me. You really are not afraid, he said, not quite a question. I have spent 11 years preparing for this exact day, I said. Fear was useful back then. It made me careful. It made me build things nobody could see. I glanced at him, and for just a moment, let a little of the weight I was carrying show through the smile. But today, fear is not going to help anyone. Today we need patience, and a very long list of phone numbers. Oliver managed a small, uncertain laugh. You make it sound like you are ordering dinner, instead of stopping a war. In a way, I said, turning back toward the war room at the end of the corridor. I am doing both. Come on, we have 72 hours, and the first call is the one that matters most. As I walked, the alarms finally quieted, replaced by the low hum of a station, preparing not for surrender, but for something the Vraxari Empire had never once considered, when it decided to threaten a small, stubborn, blue and green world at the edge of its territory. They had made their declaration. Now it was my turn to make mine, quietly, calmly, one call at a time, until the empire that thought it was about to erase Earth from the map understood exactly what it meant to underestimate a woman who never forgot a debt, never burned a bridge, and never, ever bluffed. The war room doors slid open ahead of us, and I stepped inside with my smile still in place, already running through the list of names in my head. 72 hours was not a threat. It was a countdown to their reckoning, and they had started the clock themselves. The war room was smaller than people expected when they first saw it. No giant holographic maps, no rows of blinking screens stretching to the ceiling like something out of an old film, just a long table, a handful of chairs, and a single wall display that Oliver activated the moment we walked in. I sat down at the head of the table and folded my hands together, thinking back to how all of this had started, long before Cortan Vale's face ever appeared on a screen, threatening to correct my homeworld. 11 years earlier, I had been a junior attaché, with barely enough authority to schedule meetings, let alone shape the future of an entire species. Earth had just been granted a seat, a very small and very quiet seat, at the edge of the interstellar accord, a loose collection of treaties between species who had learned, usually the hard way, that constant fighting cost more than it ever gained. We were the newest members. We were also, by every measurable standard, the weakest. I remembered sitting in my first assembly meeting, watching representatives from a dozen powerful empires argue over territory, while barely glancing in our direction. Humanity had no great fleet, no terrifying weapon, no ancient bloodline of warriors feared across 1,000 systems. What we had was something far less impressive to look at, and far more dangerous in the long run. We had the willingness to keep our word. It sounds small. It sounds almost foolish, in a galaxy where power usually meant firepower. But I had watched, meeting after meeting, as empires broke promises to each other the moment it became convenient, as alliances shifted overnight, as species with far greater strength than ours burned through trust like it was an unlimited resource. Nobody ever seemed to notice how valuable it was to simply keep doing what you said you would do, until the day they desperately needed someone who actually would. So that became my quiet, unglamorous project. While other diplomats chased headlines and grand treaties, I built something slower. I helped a struggling mining colony, on the edge of Siltar space, when nobody else would, not because Earth gained anything immediately, but because I knew, someday, the Siltar would remember. I negotiated a fair trade route for the Corveth Cooperative when 3 larger empires tried to squeeze them out, asking for nothing in return but their word that they would remember who stood beside them. I spent years like that. Quiet favors, fair deals. Debts that were never called in, patiently allowed to grow, like seeds planted in soil nobody else thought was worth farming. "Ambassador," Oliver said, pulling me back to the present. "The first channel is ready. Siltar Coalition, encrypted line." I nodded and rose, straightening my jacket. "Patch it through." The wall display flickered, and the face of Ambassador Rena Voss appeared, a Siltar elder with pale silver skin, and eyes that shifted color depending on her mood. Right now, they had gone a deep, worried blue. "Claire," she said immediately, without any of the usual formal greetings. "We saw the Vraxari fleet arrive at your border. Is it true? Have they declared war?" "They have," I said calmly. 72 hours, or they say they will correct Earth." Rena's eyes darkened further, shifting toward black. Among her people, that was the color of anger. That word. They used that word on us once, 3 generations ago, before your accord even existed. We do not forget what correction means, Claire. We do not forget what they did to the old cities. "I know," I said gently. "I have read the records. I am sorry to bring back that memory. You are not the one who should be sorry." Rena leaned forward. "Why are you calling me? You know our fleet is small. We cannot match the Vraxari alone." "I am not asking you to fight alone," I said. "I am asking you to remember the treaty we signed 6 years ago, when the Vraxari tried to seize your mining routes, and nobody else would stand with you." Article 4. Mutual defense in the event of unprovoked aggression by a third empire. There was a long pause. Rena's eyes slowly shifted from black toward a deep, thoughtful green. "You built that clause into a simple trade agreement," she said quietly. "I remember thinking, at the time, that you were being overly cautious, that no one would ever need to use it." "I am a very cautious person," I said, and allowed myself a small smile. It seems that caution is finally useful. "The Siltar Coalition honors its word," Rena said, straightening. "We will invoke Article 4. I will personally lead a delegation to stand beside you, Claire. But understand this. Our numbers alone will not be enough to stop the Vraxari fleet." "I know," I said. "You are not the only call I am making today." Rena studied me for a long moment, and something like understanding passed across her expression. "You have been planning this for years, haven't you? Long before anyone else even imagined the Vraxari would move against Earth." "I have been planning for the day someone would try," I said. "I did not know when. I only knew it would happen eventually, because it always does, to every new species in this accord. I simply made sure that when it happened to us, we would not be standing alone." Rena nodded slowly. "Then let us not waste any more time talking. Make your other calls, Claire. I will prepare my people." The screen went dark, and I turned to Oliver, who was staring at me with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. "You built a mutual defense clause into a trade agreement," he said, 6 years ago, "for a war you did not even know was coming." "I did not know exactly what shape it would take," I said, moving toward the next console. "But I knew the shape of the galaxy well enough to guess. Powerful empires do not respect weakness. They respect obligation. So I made sure Earth had plenty of obligations working in our favor, even if nobody else noticed them at the time. How many more calls do we need to make?" I thought about the list in my head, the names and faces and debts collected over more than a decade of quiet, patient work. "A few," I said, "but the next one is going to be the most important. Patch me through to the Corveth Cooperative. Ask for Director Halvard Cross." Oliver's fingers moved quickly across the console, and a moment later the display flickered again, showing the broad, weathered face of a Corveth elder, with deep-set eyes and skin like cracked stone. "Ambassador Whitmore," Halvard said, his voice a low rumble. "I wondered when you would call." "You already know why. The whole quadrant knows why," he said. "The Vraxari do not exactly move quietly. 40 warships at your border, and a 72-hour ultimatum. Bold, even for them." "I need to know where the Corveth Cooperative stands," I said. "You remember the trade corridor dispute, 3 years ago. When three larger empires tried to cut you out entirely, and Earth stood beside you at the negotiating table, even though we had almost nothing to gain from it ourselves. I remember, Halvard said. I remember you personally staying awake for 2 full days straight, refusing to leave the table until we had fair terms. I remember thinking, at the time, that no other ambassador in that room would have bothered to fight that hard for a smaller trading partner they barely knew. I told you then that I did not expect anything in return, I said. I meant it, but I am hoping, now, that you remember it anyway. Halvard was quiet for a moment, his stony features unreadable. Then, slowly, something like a smile crossed his face, an expression I had only seen from him once before, on the day the corridor dispute was finally settled in the Corveth's favor. The cooperative does not forget its friends, he said, and we do not forget the empires who have tried to bully us either. The Vraxari have made enemies of half this quadrant over the centuries, Ambassador. Perhaps it is time someone finally reminded them of that. Then you will stand with us? We will do more than stand, Halvard said. Give me the coordinates of your border. I will bring ships, and I will bring something else. Something the Vraxari fear even more than warships. What is that? Witnesses, Halvard said simply. Representatives from every species they have ever threatened, watching, recording, ready to bring their crimes before the full interstellar accord. The Vraxari like to operate quietly, Ambassador, striking small, isolated worlds where no one is watching. They will not enjoy an audience. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had not even realized I was carrying. Thank you, Halvard. I will not forget this. You never do, he said. That is rather the point, isn't it? The screen went dark again, and I allowed myself a long, slow breath. 2 calls made, 2 old debts, patiently collected over years of careful, unglamorous work, finally coming due, at the exact moment they were needed most. Oliver was staring at the darkened screen, shaking his head slowly. I have worked on this station for 4 years, Ambassador. I thought I understood diplomacy. I thought it was mostly meetings and paperwork and long, boring negotiations that never seemed to go anywhere. It usually is, I said, allowing myself a small, tired smile. Most days, diplomacy is exactly that boring. You sit across a table from someone, you argue about trade tariffs or border lines for hours, and nothing dramatic happens at all. But every once in a while, all those boring, patient years add up to something enormous, and you find out that the quiet work you did years ago was never really about the small things at all. Then what was it about? I looked out toward the viewport, where the distant lights of the Vraxari fleet still hung in the void, waiting, unaware of exactly how much trouble they had just invited upon themselves. It was about making sure that when someone finally pointed a weapon at Earth, I said, they would discover, far too late, that they were not just threatening one small, quiet world. They were threatening everyone that world had ever quietly, patiently, faithfully helped. I turned back to Oliver, and to the long list of names still waiting on my console. We have made 2 calls, I said. We have many more to go, and far less than 72 hours to make them. Let us not waste another minute. By the time the 14th hour of our 72 had passed, the war room had transformed into something closer to a command center, though not the kind built for firing weapons. Screens lined the walls now, each one holding a different face, a different species, a different quiet debt finally being called in. I moved between them with a steady, unhurried pace, even though my body had long since stopped feeling steady on the inside. Every conversation mattered. Every word had to be chosen carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect, for the years it had taken to earn the right to make these calls at all. Ambassador, Oliver said, appearing at my side with a tablet in hand, the Andun cluster is requesting a private channel. They say it is urgent. I raised an eyebrow. The Andun were not a species I had expected to hear from today. They kept to themselves, mostly, tucked away in a remote corner of Accord space, rarely involving themselves in the disputes of other empires. If they were reaching out now, something important had shifted. The screen flickered, and instead of a single face, I found myself looking at an entire council chamber. 7 Andun elders, seated in a semicircle, their elongated features calm and unreadable, in the way that species always managed, even in moments of crisis. Ambassador Whitmore, the eldest of them said, her voice carrying the slow, deliberate cadence typical of her people. We understand the Vraxari Empire has declared war upon your homeworld. They have, I said. I did not expect to hear from the Andoon cluster today. I was under the impression your people preferred to remain uninvolved in matters beyond your borders. We do, she agreed. We have remained uninvolved for nearly 300 years, watching empires rise and fall, watching wars begin and end, choosing always to protect our own people, rather than risk them in conflicts that did not concern us directly. Then why call now? The elder's expression shifted, something old and heavy passing behind her eyes. Because 40 years ago, when a plague swept through our outer colonies, and every major empire in this quadrant refused to send aid, citing quarantine risk and political inconvenience, one single delegation broke that silence. A small, struggling ship arrived carrying medicine, doctors, and no demands whatsoever in return. That ship flew under the flag of a world so new to the Accord that most of us had never even heard its name before. My chest tightened. I remembered that mission. I had been barely out of training then, assigned to the relief effort almost by accident, standing on the deck of that small medical ship as it broke through Andoon quarantine lines that every rule of protocol said we should have respected. I remember, I said quietly. I was on that ship. We know, the elder said. We have never forgotten your face, Ambassador, even all these years later. Your world saved thousands of lives that day, expecting nothing, asking for nothing, simply because it was the right thing to do. We have watched you since then, quietly, from a distance, wondering if that single act of kindness was truly who your people were, or merely a moment of unusual generosity. And what have you decided? We have decided, she said, watching how patiently and how fairly you have conducted yourself in this accord for over a decade, that it was not a single moment, it was who you are. And the Andoon cluster does not abandon those who have shown themselves to be true friends, even after 300 years of choosing not to involve ourselves in anyone else's conflicts. I felt something rise in my throat, a tightness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the weight of being remembered. I am deeply grateful, but I must be honest with you. Your fleet, from what I understand, is built for defense, not for offensive engagement. I cannot ask you to bring warships into a fight against the Vraxari Armada. We are not offering warships, the elder said. We are offering something the Vraxari value even more than military strength, though they would never admit it: legitimacy. I frowned slightly. I do not follow. The Andoon cluster has never taken a side in any interstellar conflict in 300 years, she explained. Every empire in this quadrant knows that fact. It has made our voice, on the rare occasions we choose to use it, worth more than an entire fleet in the eyes of the wider Accord. If we stand publicly beside Earth in this matter, declaring that the Vraxari's aggression is unprovoked and unjust, no other neutral power in this galaxy will be able to dismiss that claim as mere propaganda. Understanding settled over me slowly, and with it, a fresh wave of respect for exactly how much weight these 7 quiet elders carried, simply by choosing, after centuries of silence, to finally speak. You would be willing to make that declaration publicly, I said, before the full interstellar accord? We would, the elder confirmed. We will send our testimony, formally, the moment your 72 hours expire. Let every empire watching see that the Vraxari have chosen to attack a species who once crossed quarantine lines to save strangers, expecting nothing in return. Thank you, I said, and I meant it more deeply than those 2 words could ever properly carry. I will not forget this either. We know, the elder said, and for the first time, something like warmth crossed her ancient, careful features. That has always been rather the point of trusting you, Ambassador. Good fortune to your world. We hope to see you again under gentler circumstances. The channel closed, and I stood there for a long moment, my hands pressed flat against the console, steadying myself against a feeling I had not expected to hit me quite so hard. Oliver appeared at my side, quiet, watching me carefully. You never mentioned that mission, he said softly. The plague relief. 40 years ago, you said. You could not have been more than a child. I was young, I admitted. It was one of my first assignments, barely more than a volunteer post. I did not think anyone outside that mission would remember it at all, let alone remember it well enough to bring it up as a reason to risk their own safety decades later. How many more deaths like that are we going to find today? I do not know, I said honestly. I stopped keeping count a long time ago. That was rather the whole point, Oliver. If you keep count, waiting for repayment, it stops being kindness and starts being a transaction. I never wanted Earth's reputation built on transactions. I wanted it built on trust, freely given, without expectation, so that when a moment like this finally came, the response would come from genuine loyalty, not obligation. He was quiet for a moment, processing that. It worked, he said finally. It is working, I corrected gently. We are not finished yet. We still have a great deal of time to fill, and the Vraxari have allies of their own, who will not sit quietly while this unfolds. Patch me through to the Corvette military liaison. I need an updated count on the ships Halvard is bringing, and I need to know exactly how many hours out they are. Oliver nodded and moved to his console, and I turned back toward the viewport, watching the Vraxari fleet still hanging silently in the dark. From this distance, they looked patient, almost still, as if utterly confident that nothing Earth did in the next 72 hours could possibly change the outcome they had already decided upon. I thought of Cortan Vale's burning eyes, narrowed with irritation at my calm. I thought of the word correction, and every quiet, careful year I had spent making absolutely certain that word would never be spoken about my homeworld, and mean anything close to what it had meant for the Siltar's old cities, generations ago. Behind me, the room continued to fill with the quiet hum of activity, screens flickering with new arrivals, new voices, new old friends finally stepping forward at exactly the moment they were needed most. It was not loud, it was not dramatic. It was simply the slow, steady sound of a decade of patient, careful diplomacy finally paying its dividends, one honest conversation at a time. Hours passed like that, call after call, each one adding another thread to a web that the Vraxari Empire had never noticed being woven around them. Some conversations were short, simple confirmations from allies who had been waiting years for the chance to repay an old kindness. Others stretched longer, careful negotiations with cautious, uncertain powers who needed convincing that standing beside Earth would not mean standing against an unstoppable force with no hope of survival. By the 36th hour, halfway through our countdown, I finally allowed myself to sit down, if only for a moment, and look over the growing list of commitments Oliver had been tracking on the main display. Ships, delegations, formal declarations of support, testimonies prepared for the wider accord. It was not, by any measure, a force capable of matching the Vraxari armada in a direct confrontation. But that had never been the plan. Ambassador, Oliver said quietly, sitting down across from me. Exhaustion clear in his voice, but something else there too. Something that had not been present when the alarms first began screaming 36 hours earlier. Something that sounded very much like hope. Do you actually think this will be enough? Even with everyone we have gathered, the Vraxari fleet alone could still overpower us in direct combat. You are right, I said. In direct combat, we would lose badly, no matter how many allies stand beside us today. Then what exactly are we doing here? I looked at him, and for the first time since the alarms first sounded, I let the tiredness show plainly on my face, along with something steadier underneath it. We are not preparing for a battle, I said. We are preparing for a conversation. A very different one than the last one Cortan Vale and I had, and by the time we are finished, Oliver, the Vraxari Empire is going to discover that the cost of correcting Earth is far higher than the cost of simply walking away. Outside the viewport, the fleet remained still, patient, unaware. 36 hours remained on the clock they themselves had started. It was, I thought, more than enough time to finish what I had begun. The final hour of the countdown arrived quietly, without the fanfare that 72 hours of tension might have led anyone to expect. No alarms, no shouting, just the steady hum of the Horizon's engines and the soft murmur of voices behind me, as officers monitored the growing collection of ships now gathering along Earth's border, standing quietly beside our own modest fleet. I stood at the viewport, watching as vessels I had never expected to see in Earth's skies took their positions. Siltar cruisers, sleek and silver, moved into formation beside the sturdy, stone-colored transports of the Corvette Cooperative. Smaller ships from half a dozen other species I had spent years quietly building relationships with drifted into place around them, forming a loose but unmistakable presence, not large enough to overpower the Vraxari armada in raw numbers, but large enough to make one thing very clear. Earth was not standing alone. "Ambassador," Oliver said, his voice tight with anticipation. "The Vraxari flagship is hailing us again. Cortan Vale, Priority Channel." "Right on schedule," I murmured, and turned from the viewport to face the main display. "Put him through." Cortan's face appeared, and I noticed immediately that something had shifted in his expression since our last conversation. The confident irritation from before had been replaced by something more careful, more calculating, as his burning eyes scanned whatever readings his own officers were feeding him about the ships now surrounding Earth's border. "Ambassador Whitmore," he said slowly, "it appears you have been busy." "I did mention I had a few calls to make," I said pleasantly. "I hope I have not kept you waiting too long." "These vessels," he said, his voice tightening with barely restrained frustration, "belong to species who have no formal alliance with Earth. No treaty obligates them to stand at your border." "Actually," I said, "several of them do have formal treaties with Earth. Mutual defense clauses, carefully negotiated years ago, precisely for situations like this one. I would be happy to send you the documentation, since you were so concerned about paperwork during our last conversation." Cortan's jaw tightened visibly. "Formal treaties or not, this collection of ships poses no genuine threat to Imperial forces. You believe a handful of second-hand cruisers will stop an armada of 40 warships?" "No," I said honestly. "I do not believe that at all." That answer seemed to catch him off guard. His eyes narrowed, searching my expression for the trick he was certain must be hiding somewhere beneath my calm. "Then what exactly do you believe this display accomplishes?" "I believe," I said, stepping closer to the screen, "that it accomplishes exactly what it was designed to accomplish. Not a battle, Envoy Vale, a witness." "A witness to what?" "To whatever happens next," I said. "Every ship gathered at our border today carries a full communications array, broadcasting live to their respective governments, and through them, to the wider interstellar accord. Every word we exchange right now, every move your fleet makes in the coming hours, is being recorded and shared across a dozen empires who have been waiting, some of them for centuries, to see exactly how the Vraxari Empire behaves when it believes no one important is watching." I let that settle for a moment before continuing. "You have built quite a reputation, Envoy Vale, over the years. Small, isolated worlds, quiet corrections, carried out far from major trade routes, far from prying eyes. The Siltar remember what correction meant for their old cities. I imagine there are other species with similar memories, quietly waiting for a chance to finally speak about what they witnessed." Cortan's expression flickered, something close to alarm passing briefly behind his burning eyes, before he forced it back into cold composure. "You think a few witnesses will stop an Imperial fleet from carrying out its orders?" "I think," I said, "that the Vraxari Empire has built its power on more than warships. You depend on trade agreements with a dozen neighboring empires. You depend on markets willing to buy your resources and sell you theirs. You depend, whether you enjoy admitting it or not, on a galaxy that continues to view the Empire as a legitimate power worth dealing with, rather than a threat to be quietly contained." I stepped even closer to the screen, letting my voice soften, almost gentle, though every word carried weight I had spent 11 years preparing to deliver. "Right now, Envoy Vale, representatives from the Siltar Coalition, the Corveth Cooperative, and the Andoon Cluster are preparing formal testimony before the Full Accord Assembly, documenting a pattern of unprovoked aggression stretching back generations, with Earth's situation as the latest, most public example. The Andoon Cluster alone has not taken a public position on any interstellar conflict in 300 years. Their willingness to speak now, on our behalf, carries more weight across this galaxy than every warship in your armada combined." Cortan said nothing, his stone-gray features rigid, calculating. "If your fleet opens fire today," I continued, "every trade partner who has ever hesitated to deal with the Vraxari Empire will finally have the excuse they have been waiting for, to cut ties entirely. Every neighboring power who has ever quietly resented Imperial expansion will suddenly find themselves with public, documented justification to act. You did not declare war on one small, undefended world today, Envoy Vale. You declared war on every relationship Earth has spent over a decade, patiently, carefully, honestly building. And unlike your empire, Ambassador Whitmore has never once broken her word to anyone standing beside her today. The command deck behind me had gone completely silent, every officer watching the exchange unfold with something between disbelief and quiet, growing hope. On the screen, Cortan remained still, his burning eyes flicking briefly to something off camera, likely a report from his own officers, confirming everything I had just described. "You are bluffing," he said finally, though his voice carried far less certainty than the words themselves. "I never bluff, Envoy Vale," I said simply. "I find it far more effective to simply be prepared. Feel free to open fire, and discover for yourself exactly how many empires are prepared to respond. Or, alternatively, you could return to Emperor Zareth Mor and explain that the small, undefended world he intended to correct within 72 hours has instead assembled a coalition of witnesses and allies large enough to threaten the very foundation of imperial trade and legitimacy across this entire quadrant." Long seconds passed in silence. I did not move. I did not fill that silence with anything further. I had learned, over 11 years of careful negotiation, that the most powerful thing you could offer someone in a moment like this was simply the space to make their own decision, with nothing left to distract them from the consequences laid clearly before them. Finally, Cortan's shoulders shifted, just slightly, a small but unmistakable sign of retreat. "I will need to consult with the Emperor," he said stiffly. "Of course," I said, allowing warmth back into my voice, as though we were simply concluding an ordinary trade negotiation, rather than standing at the edge of a war that had nearly consumed my entire world. "Take whatever time you need. I believe you will find, however, that time is no longer working entirely in your favor." The screen went dark, and for a moment, the command deck remained utterly silent, as if no one quite believed what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, quiet murmurs began to spread, officers turning to each other with expressions of cautious, disbelieving relief. Oliver approached me carefully, his eyes wide. "Did that actually work?" "I do not know yet," I admitted, allowing myself, finally, to feel the exhaustion I had been holding back for nearly 3 full days. "But I do know this. The Vraxari Empire came here, expecting an easy correction. A small, defenseless world, quietly erased from the map before anyone important noticed. Instead, they found a witness, an alliance, and a reputation on the line that they can no longer afford to ignore. What happens now?" I looked past him, out toward the viewport, where the Vraxari fleet remained motionless, patient no longer, but hesitant, uncertain, weighing consequences they had never once considered when they first issued their ultimatum 3 days earlier. "Now," I said quietly, "we wait, and we watch, and we let an empire built on fear discover exactly how expensive it becomes to threaten a world that has spent over a decade, quietly, patiently, earning the loyalty of everyone else in this galaxy." Behind me, the growing coalition of ships held their position, steady and unshaken, a silent testament to years of careful, honest work, finally standing between my homeworld and a war it had never asked for. Somewhere out there, in the dark, Cortan Vale was carrying my words back to an emperor who had built an empire on the assumption that strength alone determined outcomes. He was about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption had always been. 3 hours passed before Cortan Vale's face appeared on our screen again, and in that time, I did not leave the command deck once. I sat with Oliver, going over reports from every allied vessel gathered at our border, watching the growing stream of testimony being submitted to the Interstellar Accord Assembly by delegations who had waited years, sometimes generations, for the chance to finally speak. The Siltar submitted formal records of the old cities, decades old but never forgotten, detailing exactly what correction had meant for their people. The Corveth Cooperative submitted evidence of 3 separate trade route disputes, where the Vraxari Empire had used the threat of force to seize territory that did not belong to them. Smaller species I had built quiet relationships with over the years, worlds most of the galaxy barely knew existed, added their own testimonies, one after another, forming a picture that no honest observer could easily dismiss. By the time Cortan's face reappeared, the assembly chamber of the Interstellar Accord had already begun an emergency session, and every major trade partner connected to Vraxari markets had quietly begun reviewing their agreements. "Ambassador Whitmore," Cortan said, and this time, His voice carried none of the cold authority from our first conversation 3 days earlier. It sounded tired, careful, and beneath that, something close to defeat. "I have spoken with Emperor Zareth Mor. And?" I asked, though I already suspected what was coming. "The Emperor has reviewed the reports from the assembly session," Cortan continued. "The trade disruptions alone would cost the Empire more in the coming year than any resources gained from correcting your world. 3 of our largest trading partners have already suspended negotiations, pending review of the Assembly's findings." "That does sound expensive," I said gently. Cortan's jaw tightened, though there was no real anger left in the expression, only exhaustion. "The Emperor has authorized me to withdraw the declaration of war." Behind me, I heard a collective breath released across the command deck, officers who had been holding themselves rigid for 3 straight days, finally allowing their shoulders to drop. Oliver closed his eyes briefly, murmuring something under his breath that sounded very much like relief. I did not celebrate. Not yet. There was still work to be done, and 11 years of careful diplomacy had taught me that the moment right after a victory was often the most important one to handle with care. "I am glad to hear it," I said simply. "War rarely benefits anyone, Envoy Vale, including the side that believes itself strongest going into it." "You have humiliated the Empire," Cortan said, and for the first time, something raw slipped through his careful composure, something that sounded almost like genuine anger, though tempered now by clear exhaustion. "Do you understand what this withdrawal will mean for how other empires perceive us?" "I understand it completely," I said, "but I want to be clear about something, Envoy Vale. This was never about humiliating the Vraxari Empire. I did not spend 3 days calling in every favor I have earned across a decade simply to watch your empire suffer. I did it to protect my homeworld from a war we never asked for, and to make sure that lesson was learned clearly enough that it would never need repeating." Cortan studied me carefully through the screen, his burning eyes searching for whatever hidden motive he assumed must be lurking beneath my words. He would not find one. There was none to find. "What do you want from us then?" he asked finally, "if not our humiliation?" I considered the question for a long moment before answering, because the answer mattered more than anything I had said in the previous 3 days combined. "I want a seat at the table," I said. "Not a surrender, not a conquest. A conversation, held in good faith, between 2 powers who clearly have very different ideas about how strength should be used in this galaxy." Cortan's brow furrowed, clearly not expecting this response. "You are offering the Empire negotiation, after everything that has happened?" "I am offering the Empire a choice," I said. "You can continue operating the way you have for generations, relying on fear and quiet corrections, to hold together an empire, built more on intimidation than genuine loyalty. Or you can consider a different approach, one that has served Earth remarkably well despite our relatively small size and limited military strength." "And what approach is that?" I allowed myself a small, tired smile. "Keep your word. Treat smaller powers fairly, even when you have nothing immediate to gain from it. Build relationships based on trust rather than fear. It requires patience, Envoy Vale, sometimes years or even decades of patience, with no guarantee of immediate reward. But when the moment finally comes where you need allies rather than subjects, you will discover exactly how much more reliable trust proves to be than fear ever could." Cortan was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his burning eyes. Not agreement exactly, but perhaps, for the first time, genuine consideration. "I will relay your proposal to the Emperor," he said finally. "I cannot promise how he will respond. 300 years of imperial policy does not change because of a single failed correction." "I do not expect it to change overnight," I said. "Change like that rarely happens all at once. It happens slowly, one honest conversation at a time, the same way Earth built the alliance that stood at our border these past 3 days. If the Emperor is willing to begin that conversation, my door remains open, whenever he is ready." Cortan gave a slow, stiff nod, the closest thing to respect I suspected he was capable of showing after everything that had happened between us. "The fleet will withdraw within the hour." "Thank you, Envoy Vale," I said. "For what it is worth, I hope our next conversation involves considerably less shouting about war and considerably more discussion about trade agreements that benefit both our peoples fairly. Something almost like the ghost of amusement flickered across his stone-gray features. "You are a strange diplomat, Ambassador Whitmore." "I have been told that before," I said. "Usually by people who eventually came to respect it." The screen went dark for the final time, and I stood there for a long moment, watching the Vrexari fleet begin its slow retreat outside the viewport, 40 warships pulling back into the dark from which they had emerged 3 days earlier. No shots fired, no lives lost, nothing but a quiet, careful unraveling of an ultimatum that had never accounted for exactly how deep Earth's roots had already grown across this galaxy. Behind me, the command deck erupted into quiet, disbelieving celebration, officers embracing each other, some crying openly with relief, others simply staring out the viewport in stunned silence, watching the retreat unfold. Oliver approached me slowly, his expression somewhere between exhaustion and pure wonder. "You did it," he said softly. "You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected gently. "Every ally who answered a call today, every debt patiently earned over the past decade, every honest handshake and fair trade agreement that seemed too small to matter at the time. This was never something I could have done alone, Oliver. It took years of quiet work from more people than I can count, most of whom never expected anything in return. What happens now?" I glanced toward the growing list of allied delegations still waiting on our comm channels, each one wanting confirmation, wanting to celebrate, wanting to discuss what came next for a relationship between species that had just been tested in the most serious way imaginable. "Now," I said, "we thank everyone who stood beside us today, properly, personally, the same way I built these relationships in the first place. And then, we get back to work, because a decade of quiet diplomacy does not end just because one crisis has passed. If anything, this is only the beginning of a much larger conversation about how Earth chooses to move forward in this galaxy." Oliver studied me carefully. "Were you ever actually afraid during all of this?" I thought about that question honestly before answering, because he deserved an honest answer after everything we had survived together over the past 3 days. "Of course I was afraid," I admitted. "Every single moment. Fear does not disappear just because you have prepared well, Oliver. It simply becomes something you carry quietly, underneath everything else, while you keep doing the work that needs doing anyway. I was terrified the moment those alarms first sounded 3 days ago. I have remained terrified through every single call I made since then. You never once showed it, because showing it would not have helped anyone," I said. "Not our people, not our allies, and certainly not us in that first conversation with Cortan Vale. Sometimes the most important thing a diplomat can offer a frightened room is not the absence of fear, but the appearance of calm steady enough that everyone else can find their own courage standing beside it." Oliver nodded slowly, clearly turning that thought over carefully in his mind. Then, after a moment, something like a genuine smile crossed his tired face. "I think I understand now why you smiled at Cortan Vale that very first day. Everyone on this deck thought you had lost your mind." "I understand why they thought that," I said, allowing myself a small, warm laugh, the first genuine laugh I had felt in 3 exhausting days. But I already knew, standing there in that first conversation, exactly how many old friends were about to answer my call. That fleet outside our window today did not appear out of nothing, Oliver. It appeared because 11 years ago, I decided that Earth's greatest weapon would never be found in warships or weapons at all. I turned toward the viewport one final time, watching the last of the Vrexari fleet vanish into the dark, an empire built on fear, retreating quietly from a world that had chosen, patiently and deliberately, to build something far more lasting instead. "Our greatest weapon," I said quietly, mostly to myself now, "was always simply this: keeping our word, treating others fairly, even when it cost us something, and trusting that somewhere down the road, that patience would matter more than any fleet ever could." Oliver reached over and picked up my long-forgotten cold coffee cup from the console, offering it back to me with a tired, genuine smile. "For what it is worth, Ambassador, I do not think anyone on this deck will ever forget what you did here today." I took the cup from him, raised it slightly toward the empty space where the Vrexari fleet had once hung, threatening everything I had spent over a decade quietly building, and allowed myself, finally, One last small, satisfied smile. Should have read the fine print, I murmured, and took a slow, quiet sip of coffee that had long since gone cold, but somehow, in that exact moment, tasted better than anything I could remember drinking in years. Behind me, the command deck continued its quiet celebration, and outside the viewport, the stars settled back into their familiar, undisturbed silence, watching over a small, blue and green world that had just proven, without firing a single shot, exactly what it meant to spend 11 patient years turning kindness into the strongest defense any empire had ever underestimated.